Okay, welcome back, everybody. Mark Thomas here. This is our third of 4 global expert webinars on the subject of environmental and social governance. If you joined us on our second webinar last week, you might remember that a few months ago, I was asked by a board of directors, a client of mine, who said, what does this ESG stuff have to do with us? And as I mentioned, as luck would have it, some of my esteemed colleagues just happen to be expert in this area. So we decided to put together this series of exploring ESG in a webinar panel series using the collective expertise of all of the guests that you'll see here on this panel. So each one of the sessions is checking the heartbeat of our ability to be sustainable and ensure a positive impact on the world. So let's take a look at what this series has looked like so far. We started off with webinar number 1. We looked at what's the overall heartbeat of ESG. We went into Green with Envy, talked about the environmental mindset and of course, this week, we're talking about social reflections. And this is interesting because corporate citizenship has really evolved from basic corporate social responsibility, or what you may have heard of as CSR, through philanthropy to having a more holistic focus on environmental, social, and governance practices. Now, these practices engage all stakeholders and are all embedded in all aspects of any enterprise. So we talked about the environmental side. We're going to jump in and talk about the social side in this piece. Now, I'm sure you recognize most, if not all, of my esteemed colleagues today. We truly have a global panel for this series, and you can see they have very deep skills in each of their crafts. As you might remember, this is an unsponsored event. Here we're here as colleagues sharing information, and our goal is to share our thoughts and ideas with you. And there's no commercial break. There's no selling you anything. Feel free to reach out to any of these professionals if you need more information. So Mark Thomas here. I'm from Arizona, but I'm talking to you from northern Minnesota today. We've got Karen from New Mexico, USA. Charlene is coming to us from Arizona. And Charlene had a bunch of thunderstorms last night, and she's on battery power right now. So hopefully we can get Charlene in on this. We have Eduardo from Washington, USA. Manny, I'm going to get this right. Manny's from Iowa, USA. We have Simone, our Australian, from France. I just love to say that. Rocky's coming to us from Indonesia. Tim's in Denmark. Turhan is in Turkey. And we have one member down today, Zain from the UAE. He could not make today's panel. So let's jump in to kind of see some of the things we want to talk about today here in a second. But remember, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, feel free to go out to the Q&A. We'll keep an eye on that. If you have a specific question for any of the panelists specifically, put their name down in the Q&A so we know we can address that with the right person for you. We may not be able to get to all questions. We want to be time conscious. We want to keep this under about an hour and a half. And of course, we're doing a recording of this webinar, and this will be available to you after we finish up. So what do you say? Let's get started. I think we've got a couple of really good questions out there for the panel. So again, we like to do the what, the now what, and the so what of our social responsibility. So remember, one of the things we want to do is really get a good, well-rounded group of individuals so we can talk about the key issues here. So what I'm going to do is start with question number 1, which is the what. What are the top environmental issues that are facing us today? And that should say social issues on this because it was a copy and paste error. So let's say that's the social issues. First one we've got is what we call labor standards. So I tell you what, I'm gonna kick this off with Rocky. Rocky, can you kick this one off for us for labor standards?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Labor standard is always an interesting topic. What I understand is it is an issue, it's a global issue, but I think every country have their own regulations about this. I believe each country have their own regulation, and it is a concern of each country. But although it is regulated, what I see on the news and on the research that there are still many issues related to these labor standards. I see that diversity and equality still exists everywhere, and the fair wages, health and well-being is now an issue. Of course, it's a pandemic and well-being, mindfulness in working, it's an issue currently. And I believe I see some of the research that child labor while it's getting down from year to year, but it still exists in some areas of the world. I think that's the issues, and maybe this fast pace of technology implementation all over the world. I don't know, maybe have some impact also to this labor standards issues.
So, I think, hey, I'm going to push this off to Charlene because there's we just had this thing called a pandemic. Well, we're still in that. So, Charlene, does this have anything to do? Is a pandemic changing anything around labor standards and regulations right now?
Actually, it does. Just a quick check. You guys can hear me, right?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. It does. For example, Google, Ford, Citicorp, all of those different major companies, JP Morgan Chase, et cetera, on the upper echelon of those types of remote working jobs, they are now saying, okay, time to come back to work. And for those employees who may have medical conditions or have extended family they need to care for, perhaps aging parents or a disabled member of the family, they enjoy the benefits of the remote work. And so bringing them back to work, they don't want to. And some of them are actually choosing to quit and find new jobs rather than not participate in a hybrid type environment. The other issue facing that group, and I'll get to the other different groups in a minute, is consistently managers in certain companies are labeling workers who return to work on the quote unquote 9-to-5 schedule as higher performing, despite concrete data that shows that less time actually spent on commute in the office, et cetera, can lead to more productivity. Now, when you're talking about frontline workers, there is such as grocery store or minimum wage jobs, the Department of Labor had to actually issue the fair labor guidance on the Family Leave Medical Act because they were finding that people of color, immigrants, women make up the majority of the essential workers on the front lines, and that they were not getting paid for overtime that they were working, or they were being taken advantage of. And so there have been a number of labor complaints filed for those reasons. And then finally, there's the idea of people of color, women, minorities, who work in environments that are traditionally have been labeled quote unquote misogynistic or emotionally and mentally difficult due to their environment, or people with handicaps. Let's face it, there are discriminatory remarks that exist in certain workplaces. And so they have found that these individuals that have traditionally experienced higher levels of mental and emotional stress, because they're in the minority group, they prefer the hybrid environment because it's less stressful for them and they're more productive. So there's a myriad of reasons, a myriad of different factors influencing when people get paid, when they come to work, how they're coming back, how they're going to be evaluated for promotions, et cetera, what the diversity is going to be. Traditionally, the diversity has been worked on before COVID quite a bit, but they also found that remote workers make up a majority of Caucasian Americans and a majority of male Americans in the United States, or in other places in the country where there's internet access. Well, there are places that are lower income that do not have internet access. So the COVID relief package, some of the states in the United States are using that to increase their broadband so that workers can engage in hybrid activity.
I think, it's really, just to pick up on some of the things Charlene was saying there, there's a really big impact on HR or human resources as a department, as, as the key linchpin within all the departments of the organization to coordinate this and the talent management issues that come from all of this. So there are new regulations that are coming through, and that's across all different countries. And of course, we have to pay attention to those. And those organizations that are globally, are across the globe as an international organization are certainly going to have to revisit and pay attention very closely to their HR policies and their programs, the way they're going to do their wellbeing programs, adjusting their old ones. Charlene said DEI is not new, remote working is not new, but it has certainly, the lens of that has been amplified now as a result of the last couple of years. So that's something organizations, you've got to check that stuff out, because those laws and both your company policy, I guess, according to your commitments to your stakeholders, as well as your moral responsibilities, are all part of this.
I agree with that. And, one of the, you talk about moral responsibilities, and there was an undertone to a lot of things that I was just listening to. And that's around human rights, because it comes down to the basic rights that all humans have. And so I'm going to turn to Eduardo, because I think you've got a little bit of background and some knowledge in this area. What do you say about human rights side, Eduardo?
Thank you, Mark. In terms of human rights, when we talk about ESG, we are talking about demonstrated respect to human rights, conventions and principles. Mm-hmm. One suggestion is to start with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also known as the UNGP. It is a set of principles that is endorsed by the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2011. And was the first global governmentally agreed standard that provides human rights guidelines that are applicable to all business enterprises, and provides a global framework on international practices and policies. It forms the basis for any human rights benchmarks and human rights disclosure, compliance, regulatory requirements. Then what we suggest is to have a look at the existing legislation and regulations. Some examples here in the US, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, CATSA, or in the UK, the Modern Slavery Act, MSA. In France, you have the duty of vigilance law. There is all of them establish an expectation that governments have that companies will implement the United Nations guidance principles on business and human rights. It's also interesting to have a look at what the surveys say about the topic. For example, in a survey by White Case, they analyzed 12 leading ESG frameworks in terms of social measurements and so on, and they found that there are several gaps in the reporting standards in regards to social. Social measurement evaluates what is most convenient for the organizations, not what is most meaningful. So. And the lack of a consistent standards that are address social measurement are creating costs and creating confusion across the ESG industry. And the existing measurement does not equip investors to respond to rising demand for socially responsible investing strategies and products. Specifically on the case of banks, BankTrack has a survey, had a survey in 2019 called Human Rights Benchmark. And they found that 4 out of 5 of the 50 largest private commercial banks are failing on human rights. Also, that they implemented less than half of the United Nations guiding principles requirements. They found also that most banks reporting covers only internal policy developments, not key human rights risks, specific impacts, or related indicators. So it's hard because no banks have established in this 2019 survey or participated in effective grievance mechanisms for individuals that were affected. So it is interesting to see that just over 1/5 of the assessed banks demonstrated senior management level sign off on policy commitments. So it is really hard because we need to move from just the discourse, just the speech, to the actual implementation of a purpose and a set of principles that will abide to the UNGP.
Well, you know, that makes sense. You know, as I listen again to a lot of the things about human rights, we talked about labor a little bit earlier. So one of the things that comes to mind is the whole idea of health and safety, right? And so, you know, a basic human right is to be, you know, have health and be safe in your environment. And I go back to thinking about things like the coronavirus, right? And there are things that have actually emerged, health and safety issues that have emerged not just from the virus itself, but to a new way of working. Charlene, I'm going to come back over to you because there were some things you were talking about earlier that I think link directly to this. And there are some studies out there that talk about things like cognitive fatigue, those kinds of things. What are some comments you've got on health and safety?
So from a health and safety standpoint, one of the things that came out of COVID was obviously the boon in Zoom meetings and telework, et cetera, et cetera. And it was very interesting. The National Institute of Health did a study, and what they found was because there's no face-to-face interaction, and a lot of times individuals are choosing not to use video for their meetings, unlike today when I don't have any power. They picking up on the nuances of communication are very difficult, and that requires more cognitive function. And in studying the numbers, they found that the ability to process information and understand the information and do your job was very tiring and fatiguing to the individual, and was very, very, very similar to an individual who was severely hearing impaired, which for someone who is deaf and wears a cochlear, I found that to be very fascinating. And what they discovered was that after, say, 2 or 3 Zoom meetings, specifically back to back, the employee was experiencing the same mental cognitive fatigue that a person who is deaf and wears a cochlear or wears hearing aid experiences in trying to understand the communication. If you think about it for a minute, we rely so much on the physical cues for human communication, facial expressions, reading the lips, body language, et cetera, et cetera. When you're doing that through Zoom, you're not picking up on all of that. So your mind has to work twice as hard to figure out what the other person is not only saying, but what they actually mean. The other thing that was fascinating is that there is a sort of disconnect, an emotional and mental disconnect. And I found this last night. Some employees are struggling with mental health issues because they are at home and they haven't been out, and they don't feel a part of the team. So it's going to be interesting to find out how this hybrid, there are positives to hybrid work, but there are also negatives to hybrid work. It's going to be interesting to find out how that's going to play out. I also, in the construction industry, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but the Department of Labor in the United States has issued guidance on how you return to work. And there's a whole gambit of, can employers require testing? What are you going to do if you do have symptoms of COVID, or you have a family member who was exposed and now you're exposed? So all of that is going to make it very complicated.
Hey, Simone, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, it certainly does make a huge difference. You know, there's a lot of things, even from the human rights, you know, talking about the modern slavery, you know, which is actually known as transnational crime now. And that's in all facets of our world. It's not just the vulnerable in developing countries. The vulnerable people exist everywhere. And certainly the response by governments for some of them has been terrific. And that has gone some way to assisting us. But, you know, there's a term out there which is a really scary one for me called digital hunting fields. And that's where we have, you know, traffickers actively pursuing a victim, typically through social media. Initially, the friendly introduction, we've seen some of that, but they can become more aggressive. But also too, from a HR and talent management perspective, some of these people are disguising themselves as agencies, as recruiting agencies, etc. So there's a lot that we can actually do, I think, from a business perspective, in regards to that, and which we'll talk a little bit more in our So What and Now What. But the other facet to this is our own people can be targeted, both internally within our organization as well as externally. And we have a responsibility. There's the physical well-being, which we're quite used to in OH&S. Both my parents were involved in OHS, and both have had to deal mostly in the trauma side of employees. And I myself, you know, with a connection with that. So we have the physical well-being. Everyone knows when you break your leg, okay, go to hospital, you might be in a cast, you might have to be at home for 10 days off work, but, you know, they'll put in a phone line for work and they'll make sure you're all set up, you know, remote. But what they haven't done is really seen emotional well-being and mental well-being as part of the same program, that it's just as important that this is dealt with from a medical perspective. You know, it's OH&S on steroids, if you like. So, you know, my crocodile brain really wants to rip into this. My emotional brain is having a hijack at the moment. And my thinking brain right now is actually searching for an appropriate yet valuable, impactful statement. In other words, loading. Because the point is, until we deal with the crocodile and emotional brain, we can't even get to the thinking brain. So look at the facts from places like, there's a number of statistics for workplace organisations as well. Look at, you know, obviously I'm looking at this from an Australian perspective as well. Black Dog Institute, they've got things around workplace wellbeing, organisations like Beyond Blue. We've got 80+% of employees avoiding discussing it due to the stigma of mental illness. You've got 70+ feel that they're going to be treated unfairly, you know, performance-wise. You know, if I broke a leg, you wouldn't say I couldn't do my job, but oh no, you know, I need some time out right now to get my head together. Oh dear, oh my gosh, should we look for someone to replace this person because their performance is going to go down? So there's a real problem here in regards to that. And not only are those that, you know, we've also got 70+% of people, not that they just feel that they're going to be treated unfairly, but it's actually happened. They've experienced it. So it still remains stigmatized. There's a lot of employers frequently think that they would not employ someone with a known mental disorder. And so therefore employees are risking a whole lot because they're unwilling to disclose it. So we've got to look at things like, there are sustainable brands out there that do focus around this. And as corporations ingrain those sustainable practices into their supply chains, okay, then they've got to put it into their supply chains, because corporate social responsibility efforts are no good if they're going to overlook this element, because it is the common thread that weaves across everything, whether you're in construction or otherwise.
I'd like to follow in on Simone's comment. There was a study 3 years ago, and it was a result of what Google had initiated. And what they had done was initiated hiring what they call neurodiverse individuals.
Yes.
And these were individuals who had different neurological backgrounds, and they purposely did not label them as disabilities. They purposely labeled, quote unquote, if that's the right word, these individuals to be neurodiverse. And these are individuals with perhaps a learning disability, perhaps on part of the autism spectrum, perhaps with some some type of mental health medical issue. And they discovered that these individuals, if provided the right environment and support, and perhaps even a mentor that can help them navigate the working world, they were actually better coders for software programming.
Yeah, it's the focus.
And hackers, right?
Yeah.
And so we are not. I think COVID, like every other industry, has forced the HR perspective to really take a look at the mental health and mental well-being and mental talents, diverse talents of the individuals that they can hire and that they can use.
Yeah, the key points that are popping up is from like Center of Disease Control and Prevention, the number of adults suffering from anxiety and depression has jumped fourfold. Now, that's a huge, when you think about what the statistics were before, that's huge. Psychological safety is in everyone's sort of vocabulary, and I really don't want to see that term become over-abused and therefore nullified or, downgraded anyway. Leadership needs to be provided with the capability and competency to understand and look after mental illness and well-being. And we need to have empathic leadership. So if anything else, 2020 has certainly taught us that mental health is a widely under-resourced area.
Guys, my apologies. I've got to move on. We've got a couple more questions to go. We've got a few things I want to hit on customer responsibility. Without any opening, I'm just going to go right to you, Manny.
Thanks, Mark. I think we've kind of touched upon the panelist about the different aspects of what organizations should do. One of the interesting aspects here is, as customers, could we make organizations do what we want them to do? Now, we've heard this mantra a lot, many times, about customer centricity, which clearly means that organizations are designing products, which is the what the customer wants. So customer is at the centricity. Now, if we translate that and say, if customers can also define how you build those products, that's going to be the next big thing. And we've seen a lot of this happening. I quote an example from one of the major US sports and apparel company, which initially was built on a business model for finding the lower cost of labor, which eventually led them into child labor, exploitation, etc. And then when they started seeing backlashes from customers as well as their social media campaigns, etc., they realized that they have to transform. So innovation in this case is not an optional thing. They went back to transform from sustainability and having a circular economy, which focused on reducing waste and putting it back in the life cycle. Now, some of the key things in here, and I'm kind of using innovation as a tool here, is how did they use recycled plastics to actually make football kits? How did they conserve water? By making sure that they're using a carbon-based dyeing process, which consumes at least 75% less water. How renewable energy was used, right? From wind companies tying up with them. And we touched upon supplier chain, some of my esteemed colleagues did. They made sure that their suppliers were what we call in our cybersecurity world, the right to audit, right? So they had the right to audit and establish tighter controls for suppliers to see if they were violating any code of conduct. And if they were, in some of the countries, they were actually removed from the list. So I think as customers, we have the responsibility as well as the power to make organizations transform and follow the social aspect of it.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And that goes back to an organization's responsibility around things like philanthropy and community involvement. So Karen, I want to bring you in on a little bit of this because I know you've got some background in this. Is there a link here, or is there anything involved when we talk specifically about philanthropy and community involvement of organizations?
Absolutely. So, it used to be that company leaders would make broad public statements about how they support human rights, they're all for gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. But, when you looked at it, it was really more out of convenience and political expediency. I mean, today, the ESG movement is demanding that companies now demonstrate tangibly how they're supporting economic value creation of social progress. So, I had mentioned in an earlier webinar that there's these different organizations that actually provide ESG ratings to companies. And one of the things they're looking at is what their social value is. And so where are their philanthropic dollars going? How do they decide where to give the money? And to what extent are they really investing in the communities in which they do business? Now, what we've seen over the past few years is that more companies are prioritizing their employees and acknowledging their employees' value by giving and matching to the causes that their employees care about. Now, in our last webinar, the CEO we interviewed had stressed the importance of shifting focus away from proving a return on investment on ESG spend. And because when you do that, from the philanthropy perspective, it then allows local communities to take the driver's seat to determine what their needs are and what impact they really want to create. And then these community-led approaches really give companies a chance to better understand the local dynamics of their customers. And that can actually lead to more effective business investment opportunities down the road.
And that makes a lot of sense. And that's a great way for us to transition kind of into the next set of questions. So we've been able to really hit what we say are the what's, and there's a lot of information in there in the what's. So here's where I've been thinking is, of course, we don't want to focus everything on just the pandemic, but this pandemic exposed these gaps, and there was a lot of weaknesses in global health, social issues. So it's not surprising that attention on social factors of ESG have increased. What are some of the major social challenges companies are having to deal with right now? So this is on the so what side. So I'm going to start off here. Of course, we talk about employee physical safety and health, and we kind of kicked this off a little bit earlier. Simone, you had really kind of started when you and Charlene were talking about this, but you were really hitting on the mental health and the kind of that link there. Can you expand on that one a little bit?
Yeah. One of my favorite actresses, Glenn Close, she actually said what mental health needs is more sunlight, more candor, and more unashamed conversation. And I think that says a lot when we talk about the so what. That the stigma, to remove the stigma, needs a shift in culture and mindset. We need to remove the shame. That, as I said, seeing the broken leg, we need to treat mental health in the terms that it's not, it's just as important to look after that side of thing. One of the key things is we need to do a bit of synaptic pruning here. There's a bit of relearning and reprogramming that has to go on both individually and within the organizations. I mean, I myself was reprogrammed, you know, coming in from the military. When I went into the civilian environment, I had to learn to think differently. I had to learn to respond differently, because some of the responses I would have had in the army would not have been suitable in a, you know, marble and brass suits environment. However, you know, that's where the empathic leadership comes in, and increasing the competencies of the leaders. You know, it comes in things like, just look at, you know, recent Olympic athletes, tennis stars, you know, who have chosen to look after their mental health because of the level of stress that they're suffering. Yet look at the response. Not everyone was supportive. And I found that really hard to watch. And, you know, it must have been so hard for them. And I can understand why they go off social media as a result, so they don't see that. I mean, I purposely stay off the news channels because it's very, very rare do you see the feel-good movies, because it impacts the way I'm feeling, and that impacts my decision-making, because emotions are a driving factor in how we make our decisions. So you know, companies are integrating mental well-being as part of their sustainability programs. But a yoga class doesn't cut it, okay? Having a stress, it's good, but it doesn't cut it. They have introduced, and this is important, mental health first aid officers now, not just straight physical first aid, but mental first aid. But that also, it only says that you've got someone to deal with it if it goes wrong. It's not actually looking at the preventative measures. So it's great that mental first aid officers have been introduced, but again, it's not far enough. A responsible workplace is going to make every effort to reduce those stigmas, encourage help seeking support, those kinds of things. We've got to challenge those misconceptions. And that means the same thing for our own self-talk. So you'll recognize this one and you say, oh, I'm so OCD when it comes to cleaning my desk. Now, that's a fixed mindset. That's one that we've talked ourselves into saying, that's who we are. That is my mental illness, or, you know, that's what I'm more likely to do. And it doesn't mean we're necessarily, or if we say, oh, someone's bipolar, just to explain someone's behavior. But given that 1 in 4 Australian workers experience a mental illness, it's more likely than not that when we say something like that, that they're going to feel disrespected or ostracized by those kinds of terms that are being used. So we really have to learn, reprogram ourselves, relanguage ourselves. You know, I have been that person that was found in the workplace bathroom under the bathroom sink, and I have been through all of that. This is why I'm so passionate about it. I do not want anyone to ever have to feel that way and go through the recovery that's required.
So I have to tell you, synaptic pruning, never heard of it. I'm surrounded by some of the smart people in the world right now. Didn't know what synaptic pruning was until today.
Oh, well, I tell you what, we can talk more about it when we save an hour. There you go.
We only have an hour and a half, Simone. Hey, so you and Charlene kind of hit this hard in the last question. Charlene, follow up to that on the physical side.
There's quite a bit on the physical side. A lot of companies throughout the world are struggling with how to have a work site that is physically safe. So, for instance, and I'm going to talk about the United States first, and then other companies throughout the world. One of the things that one of the guidance that OSHA released is they said, quote, OSHA permits employers to conduct work site COVID testing, quote unquote, if applied in a transparent manner applicable to all employees, i.e. non-retaliatory. And then OSHA permits temperature testing, again, if applied in a manner applicable to all employees, i.e. non-retaliatory. And then the determination as to whether employees wear protective equipment. The guidance is that the employer, quote, must conduct a hazard assessment in accordance with OSHA's PPE standard, according to the federal statute, and if applicable, to determine the PPE requirements for their unique work site. Now that's very broad, but from if you're talking about a work office perspective, how are you going to manage that? And then from a construction perspective, I know that we at my company are beginning to get requests from both private and federal agencies to revamp and remodel and change things like ventilation and office workspace and barriers and how they're going to protect the employees for the future. Now, how does this impact globally? Well, if you have a company such as the one that I work for that has offices in different countries, those OSHA regulations or the equivalent of what those countries have are going to be applied in different ways. So how do you meet that demand? The other question is back to tying in the physical to the mental, as Simone talked about. You have workers that, if they're required, if the employer is requiring that there is some sort of guidance in place for each employee when they come to work, mandating a COVID vaccination versus mandating COVID testing. How are you going to do that? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going, if the employee chooses not to receive the vaccination, are you going to pay for them to have negative COVID testing every so often, however many days? So there's a myriad of issues to consider. And that's growing, not just from the COVID standpoint, that's growing from environmental factors that we discussed in our first webinar, such as noise and the environment and pollution and et cetera. So it's all beginning to come together.
Yep, and I think that makes sense. But I want to move on because I know we could be on that subject for a while. But from an organizational perspective, I'm a CEO, CFO, chief operating officer. One of my concerns with this is obviously labor, right? And so when we look at labor shortages, frontline workers during the pandemic, unionization fights, those kinds of things. There's a labor piece, I think, in here that I want to make sure we hit. And I'm going to jump over to you, Manny, and see if you got some comments on this one.
Yeah, I think when we talk about it from the worker standpoint, right, there are two sides of the same coin, right? It's a give and take in any economy. And given the situation that has been, right, we've seen a lot of shareholder activism that has been fueled by the labor market, especially employees, was kind of going in saying, hey, if we cannot do the sounding board directly, we would make sure that we make the shareholders aware so that they can talk about different conditions, etc. Now, if you see, and you rightly said, right, that there's all these frontline workers working through it. Companies have actually gone ahead and acknowledged the fact that how the different workers have, moved on and kind of supported them. They're rolling out incentives. In US, there are companies who have rolled out incentives. While the other side of that is some of the employees and employees union has actually gone in and filed petitions about, like in the IT industry, they've petitioned if the cases are increasing, should we go back into the office? In one of the city unions in US, they filed, a complaint against the city for mandating return to work without considering family health issues, productivity issues, etc. And then there are instances, of a French telecom company way back, which was creating or charged with creating a psychological stressful environment that actually encouraged 22,000 employers or workers to quit. So I think it's a balancing act that companies need to kind of work through and then move forward. And that's how they're going to achieve, because at this point in time, it's, you have shortages around there. People are not willing to take the risk. So how do you ensure that you mitigate the risk as you move forward?
And that makes sense. And one of the things you talked about was shortages. And when I think shortages, of course, I think supply chain next, right? Because there's a custody of services that take place between multiple service providers when we're trying to produce a product or service. So, Rocky, I'm going to go over to you because I know you've got some experience in kind of the expectations of companies and how they monitor their supply chains from this perspective.
Yes, I understand that if we are doing or we are implementing ESG, we are concerning with social issues. We need to ensure also that all our suppliers is also concerned with that issue. But I think this quite changed in this condition, with this pandemic condition, as if I see that some of the business is just goes bankrupted, and I see that some big companies shifting their supply chain to a much lower or cost efficient suppliers. I think that's one of the issue that is happening right now, Mark. And if we are talking in some developing countries, I understand there's also a problem with the infrastructure. So a lot of people are getting impact of this COVID, and the supply chain is also get impacted. So maybe internet access infrastructure is still problem in some areas. Electricity infrastructure is still also problem in some areas, while they need to work from home. So I think this changes the map of the supply chain of a lot of companies, Mark.
I'd like to use this as a segue that on the side of vendors and the suppliers themselves, it is important to add clauses to the contracts with those vendors, and clauses that abide by principles and social standards, so that what you are deciding your organization is going to do in regard to ESG, specifically in social, that your suppliers, your vendors are going also to follow that. You have to realize, working with your legal department, that local regulations might affect what your organization can require or what it can just use to select suppliers. But not putting just clauses in contracts with vendors and with suppliers is not enough. You need to ensure that you exercise due diligence, trust but verify. You have to establish an audit process, so that to ensure that the clauses that are in the contracts are being followed. It's not an excuse to say, oh, but I told them to do it. If they are not doing, what can I do? No, your shareholders, your stakeholders will hold you accountable, will hold your company accountable. So one smart way that many organizations do is to add communications channels for customers and suppliers, so that they have a way to raise concerns directly to your organization. So concerns about suppliers not following what is in the clauses, or suppliers violating issues that you consider important in ESG for your organization. And also, it's important to establish an investigation process to address those concerns, so that you're going to audit on a regular basis, but also when you have an incident, that your organization can go and understand what is the root cause, so they can be addressed specifically in regard to that incident, but also be applied as lessons learned to the other suppliers?
Okay, I think I want to just join back on what Eduardo mentioned. And if you look at it from that perspective, right, just demonstrating compliance with regulations and legislation is one aspect of it. But how can we look at it proactively and start incorporating supply chain requirements right in the supplier risk management, vendor risk assessment process? So it all starts, you can move the needle further up and start looking at it from having the supply chain leaders embed ESG as part of their, data gathering that they do in cybersecurity, data privacy, compliance requirements. So if you see, and there's a lot of discussion on the supply chain attacks that's happening. So it's not like an isolated case right now. And how you make sure that when you're gathering data from a cybersecurity data risk or a third-party risk management perspective, how do you integrate that back into the data that you need from an ESG perspective? So it's kind of a holistic view that would help companies to, improve their ESG postures as well as work through in a longer-term perspective.
Makes sense. Guys, I'm going to move on next because we have a really interesting topic coming up, which I think clearly falls within the scope of what we're talking about here as diversity, equity, and inclusion. Karen, I'm going to jump over to you. What is this thing all about? Can you kick us off on DEI?
Sure. Okay, so this is another huge social factor in ESG. It's DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those three little letters really cover a whole lot of ground. So 2020 was really defined by COVID, right? We all agree on that. And through COVID, longstanding societal issues were brought to the forefront. Now, when the highly visible social movements took off last summer, companies suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs. They were being pressed to declare their commitments to causes and to tell the public the steps they were taking to support social justice. Now, I don't know about you, but I got a ton of emails from about every company I did business with over the past 5 years. But how many of them are really doing something of substance versus just window dressing to avoid looking out of touch? Now, companies really have to have increased awareness of some of the longstanding DEI challenges. For example, structural racism, implicit biases that get baked into their product designs. And, a big thing, those of us in tech, we talk about this a lot, right? There continues to be an imbalance of women and people of color in tech roles, especially at executive levels. Now, some DEI challenges many companies are grappling with right now include, is inclusion implicated in your corporate vaccination mandates? How are you making return to work plans inclusive? How are you going to ensure that DEI considerations are applied to your hybrid workforce? Have you revamped your employee benefits programs to address DEI? Now, Tim, you and I were just talking about some very specific corporate examples, and I thought it might be interesting for you to share those.
Sure. Yeah. So these are kind of high profile, let's call them household name companies. I'm not going to name them, but I mean, kind of, so it's not as if they don't have the financial resources to get things right, but I think they're quite worrying. So let's start with one of them, which is a home delivery, a food delivery service, a global company. This particular case was from the UK against a poor delivery driver who, despite having a 94% approval rating for his work, he needed to use facial recognition software before he could, start using his account before he could actually start driving his vehicle. Now, this gentleman was a person of color, and if you've read up on this, on the inherent flaws in facial recognition software, there tends to be a high percentage of cases where the facial recognition software is flawed. Now, unfortunately, as I said, it didn't recognize him, and he repeatedly tried this. And because of the way this company had set up its operational process and procedures, that then triggered the company's safeguarding protocols, which basically stops people other than the drivers using their account. And then instantaneously terminated this gentleman's profile. And then he automated a message to him stating, "We have made a difficult decision to end our partnership with you." Now, he also then tried to appeal into the system of his company, didn't get anywhere, and it's now hit the press, the media, and he's quoted as saying it was as if he was talking to a remote controlled person or a robot, which
he
probably,
had
at the end
no
of the day,
recourse at all, right? No recourse at all.
absolutely. And this is where we talk about, I think what Eduardo was talking about, third parties. A lot of organizations are dependent upon third party components, so looking at the accountability of, where does the fault lie? And in actual fact, the third party facial recognition software, again, I'm not going to name the company. It's a household name. We actually all use this software ourselves, probably in the corporate environment. So that resulted in this guy losing his job, basically fired by an algorithm. Another couple of examples, again, another household name, we're probably using their devices. They introduced a credit card a year or two ago, and it was discovered by a Danish couple living in New York, both wealthy, both kind of in very well-paid jobs, big property owners. You would deem not having a care in the world, but they discovered that they both had a card through this company, but that they were getting unequal treatment, especially in terms of credit ratings. So the male in the relationship was having more benefits presented to him than the female, and they basically took this to the press, and the company involved did to give them their due, did actually investigate this and actually correct it. So there was a sexist bias in this product. And then the last example is a similar vein, not a big tech company, but we're in healthcare now, and this was a similar situation, but we were talking about racist bias. And what was happening, that if you were white skinned, you were getting more preferential health choices and treatment choices than if you were a person of color. Because again, there was an inherent bias in racist bias in the algorithm, which was filtering out the preferential treatment for people of different ethnicities. If you were to take this a stage further, then what's the consequence of that? Well, people have prolonged illness, consequently, potential death. I could go on. There's so many examples which I think should worry us all.
Nope, thank you. So I just want to do a shout out for you, Tim, because I do read a lot of articles and a lot of posts that you put out on your LinkedIn. Just want to share it with some folks. Again, this is not an advertisement, but I will say Tim posts a lot of very, very good stuff out on his LinkedIn, and many of the examples that you're hearing about today, you can find out there on that. So anyway, that's a personal shout out for you, because I like how I stay updated through your LinkedIn in many cases. But those are just a couple of really, really good examples. Now, I want to go back to Manny. All right, Manny, I know you've got some other examples with other organizations and in some of the research you've been doing. You want to close this one out for us?
Yeah. And not more from the organization side, but I would just want to close this up with what we're seeing in US, right? Companies are ramping up their DEI reporting, and that's just not that, because from an ESG reporting standpoint, focus on DEI is no longer a nice to have. So you're seeing the SEC came up with the Human Capital Data Disclosure Rule, and now a lot of companies have to provide transparency into their diversity programs, as well as what metrics and key performance indicators, KPIs, they're using. And some nice things that we are seeing kind of happening is, what's your employee engagement score? What's your leadership trust scores? What's the diversity by gender, age, disability, race, etc.? So I think the leadership diversity. So there are certain metrics and measures that companies are building in, as well as putting forward for the world to see, and that's how you measure it, right? So I think tying it back to the examples that have been given, if you have the reporting requirements around it, there's sure ways that it would surface faster than somebody going to press and actually talking about it.
Got it. No, that makes total sense. Guys, thank you very much for that closeout on that, Manny. You guys know what? This next one, we could be on social media and disinformation all day. But you guys know we're down to about 20 minutes left of this. I'm going to kick this off with you, Turhan. Can you give information on social media?
Yes, thank you very much. The use of social media has increased highly effective communication platforms where any users virtually anywhere in the world can create content and disseminate this information in real life to global audience. So it's very effective tool. Enterprises are using this social media to increase brand recognition, sales, revenue, and customer satisfaction. If you look at the social media from the ESG perspective, social media usage incorporates social responsibility and ESG activities, allow creation and interactive dialogue between company and the stakeholders. Social media is a very critical tool to bring awareness and inspire action among your target audiences. So, what are the benefits? The benefits of the social media, as I've told you, build relationship, not only for the customers, also to grow your professional network, to share your expertise in order you have the opportunity to talk about what you know, what you are best, so you can share this information with the people. You can increase your visibility, you can educate yourself, you can connect anytime, anywhere. So it is a lot of beneficial factors. But it also has some drawbacks. It also has some negative effects. If I take it from the user's perspective, one of the drawbacks is the invasion of the privacy. What I mean by the invasion of privacy is intrusion on a person's circulation or solitude, or public disclosure of embracing private facts about a person, publicity that the person places a person in a false light in the public eye. These are some of the examples of invasion of privacy. Then you have next drawback is the identity theft, which is wrongly obtaining using another person's identity information in a way that involves fraud and deception. Then you have another drawback, which is cyberbullying. Cyberbullying includes sending, posting, or sharing negative, harmful, false, or mean content about someone else. Or depression and anxiety. Spending too long on a social network site really can affect your anxiety and it can cause depression. Also, you can get unrealistic expectations if you use the social media. Another drawback is the unhealthy sleep patterns. Spending too much on the time on the social media can lead to poor sleep. If you take it from the enterprise side, there is also another drawback is the introduction of viruses, malware to the organizational network, like data leakage, theft, system downtime, misuse of enterprise-side customer information to hijack corporate presence in the social media, which can cause some customer legal actions, exposure of customer information, reputational damage. Another drawback is the unclear and undefined content rights, which is posted on the social media by the enterprise, can also cause you some legal rights, legal issues. Moving to the digital business may also increase customer service expectancy. So if you customer dissatisfaction can occur and lead into potential reputational damage and customer retention issues. Also, mismanagement of the electronic communication that may be impacted by the retention regulations and e-discoveries. Use of personal accounts to communicate the work-related or enterprise-related information, which can cause also privacy violations, reputational damage, and loss of competitive advantage. Uncontrolled employee posting pictures and information that is linked with the enterprise can cause you some brand damage. Excessive employee use of social media can lead to the productivity issues. These are the main issues that I want to mention.
I think that makes sense. Hey, so Kim, you have a lot of background in this. You have a follow-up to a couple of the points that Turhan has?
Yeah, absolutely. Conscious of the limited time we got available, just pick up on the, to link it to some actual cases. So, and I'm going to mention this name. I mean, I think it would be, everyone would kind of think it's strange if I don't, but I mean, I think, Facebook obviously has had a lot of exposure in the last few years. And when we're looking at the use of Facebook and, the whole Cambridge Analytica case, which, if you remember back to it, the Cambridge Analytica used this app called This Is Your Digital Life, which was, used to harvest data from more than 50 million Facebook profiles. The users who authorized the app to have access to their data were told that the information was being used for academic research. And, we all know now that the data was subsequently used for targeting users with political ads and influence them on their choices. And we can look at, elections, we can look at, major political movements like the Brexit decision in the UK and question, what part that played into it. I think we, talking about social media, we should also look at, other things like Twitter and how they've been used, certainly in a political context. You can go back to the 2016 US election and look at the, there was a profile called American Right Now, which was pumping out, and this is, the concept of a social media bot, which is, a robot that is just pumping out messages on Twitter. And, in this particular case, it pumped out over 500,000 messages, over 500,000 tweets. And in some cases, the tweets were being multiple tweets in one particular minute. So the problem was, Mark, is that people didn't know whether it was a human or whether it was a robot, and it subsequently was a robot. But these were quite divisive, in some cases, racist tweets that, questionable could have influenced an election. I also just want to pick up on the point that that Turhan mentioned, that was, identity theft. And there's, horrific, I mean, we hear about identity theft often, and it always tends to be somebody else. But, I know a couple of people who've had their identity stolen. But one particular horrific case I heard about, not somebody I knew, but this is a woman living in Utah, in the US. She had her children taken away from her through the actions of a medical identity thief. And in her particular situation, what happened is that an imposter had taken her identity information, and in this case, just gleaned it from a simple phone book call. But when we look at how much information we put up on social media, that makes it even more horrific, I think. And what happened was the imposter went round to emergency rooms around Utah seeking painkiller drugs. Eventually the police were called, and they came and they arrested this person who had that addiction. But then they also went to the victim's house, whose identity had been stolen, and they also arrested her and took her kids away from her because she, apparently, according to the all the records, was a bad mother, and she had a drug-seeking behavior, so was not fit to be a parent. And in the end, it took her 3 months and a DNA test, and working with the state attorney general to get cleared and to get her kids back. I mean, I think that's horrific. I'm also just going to briefly mention cyberbullying, which Turhan also mentioned, and he gave an excellent description there. But, in the US, in New Jersey in 2011, it was the Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights was enacted, which was prompted by a case involving the suicide of a student at a university after his sexual orientation had been revealed by one of his fellow students. And this guy killed himself because of, using, the fact that he was on social media and the accessibility that provides. So, back in the old days before social media, the accessibility was a lot lower to that type of information. So just a few cases. Again, I could go on, but in the interest of time, I'll stop there. Thanks, Mark.
Oh, makes sense. Good. Hey, another question I want to hit with you guys. Community investment, folks, we're probably going to deal with that one on a different webinar series that we may do in the future. I want to move to the now what. This is where we're going to start providing some, some advice and some things that folks could take away from this call. So I'm going to kick this off very quickly. Then, Karen, I'm going to jump to you for some of your follow-up because, when it comes to the role of the board, because, the board is a governing body, right? We need to understand the impacts to the organization. And this is distinct from management. Most boards think, they think a lot about compliance and performance, how we balance those. But, this comes down to good stewardship, because not only is your reputation an asset, but your workforce cares about your actions as a governing body. So I think it's not just focused on financial, but one of the things that I would suggest, obviously, the board, we'll talk a lot about this in the next webinar when we wrap this up with governance. But this topic needs to be a board level topic, or at least a committee that advises the board on certain aspects of this. And of course, things like policies, like your code of conduct, and those types of things, I think is very important from a governing body level. So Karen, any advice from you from a high level for boards on this topic?
Sure. I've got 4 key actions that I think boards need to take relative to being more responsible with ESG. First of all, I would say reaffirm your corporate values and then be very clear in your purpose, because your purpose is your core reason for existing. So can the board members answer this question? What will the world lose if our company ceases to exist? Because your purpose then is going to be your North Star against which you will stress test all your critical decisions. The second is that make sure your board practices embrace the purpose. So broaden the definition of risk to include ESG considerations. I would tie executive compensation to ESG commitments. And then your board composition should reflect ESG interests and diversity. The third is just remember, you can't be all things to all people. I mean, no company can work on every issue effectively. So figure out where you have the expertise to position yourself externally as specializing in certain issue areas. And then you want to clearly identify the social impact issues that you're working on. Make sure you publicize that to both internally and externally, because then it's going to make it easier for funders to understand you. And that will most likely increase investment in your work. And make sure you continue to reach out to diverse stakeholders so you can stay informed on the very important social issues that you're going to focus on. And then the fourth thing, of course, is measure your progress. You may not have all the answers, and some of this work is going to take years to demonstrate results, but take the time to show how you are measuring your impact and how you're evolving your metrics. And especially for a lot of publicly traded companies, you have to do that now anyway.
Yeah, and the only thing, Karen, I would add to that is going the other way around. It's great for boards to, take on the mantle and be responsible. But, through these webinars and all the other references we've mentioned and statistics and bodies that, you see things that are happening in your organization. You see things that are happening in your role or in teams. And you also have a responsibility to go back and question the board, because that's where the decisions are made.
You got it. Good advice. Hey, let's move to the next one. Hey, how do we hit this right note? Tim, I'm going to go back. You had mentioned some really neat things, especially when you were talking about the EU and some considerations around privacy. Can you have anything how you can hit the right tone here for us?
Unmute.
You're muted, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. No, you're right. I mean, it's, I was on mute. No, but you're right. There are some kind of, I think, sometimes the terminology and the understanding of what we consider, certainly in Europe, as rights and certainly, the origins of privacy, the origins of data protection are quite different from both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, the right to respect for private life, for example, and the right to personal data protection, although they're closely related, they are distinct rights. And the right to privacy referred to in European law as the right for the respect of private life emerged in international human rights law in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, after the Second World War, adopted in 1948 as one of the fundamental protected human rights. Europe then also affirmed this right in the European Convention on Human Rights, a treaty that is legally binding on its contracting parties, and that came in shortly after in 1950. So both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the UN and the European Convention on Human Rights were adopted well before the development of the technologies that we're talking about, well before development of computers, well before the internet, and basically, before the rise of what we may call the information society. And let's remember, these developments have brought considerable advantages to individuals and society. It's improved quality of life, efficiency, and production. But at the same time, as we've been discussing, and some of the examples I've given myself, they present new risks to the right to respect for private life. And in response to, for specific rules for governing the processing of data, a new concept of privacy has emerged, known in some parts of the world as informational privacy. Some call it data privacy, and in others, the right to informational self-determination. So I think sometimes the terminology can kind of twist us up a bit, but I think at the end of the day, we get the feeling what the issue's about.
I think you're right. So let's finish this up talking about leveraging technology. I originally wanted to really get into the ethics of this, but I think we can really wrap that one up into the next webinar we've got here. So, Karen, can you mind just kind of kicking us off on this one, and then Eduardo, I want to move to you next and see if you have any final comments on this.
Okay.
Sure. Basically, I think in terms of how you can leverage it. My thing is about always think about the ethics, right? Think about the ethics of what you're trying to do. And just very briefly, because I know we're short on time, I think applying some sort of ethical framework in our innovation process is going to hopefully always lead us to do the right thing. Because when you think about it, great innovative social companies have and evolved what I call a moral imagination, and their approach is also people-centric, and so they are motivated serving the people's needs.
You got it. Eduardo, your comments on this one.
No, in terms of technology for social good, we can refer to the several cases that are happening now in Africa, where mobile and broadband are in high adoption rates, and where you have one case that is developed by one of the large tech vendors is mothers that are 800 miles away, being their pregnancy is being followed up through mobile phones and smart devices that are very simple, but they are giving away by not-for-profit organizations to those mothers, and the doctor only intervenes and flies in when there's a high risk. That's a way. Another way is AI and big data, where AI is used to find patterns that humans cannot realize, for example, in transportation, healthcare, now in COVID, and relating to underrepresented communities, and identifying how government and how not-for-profit organizations, how corporations can help to intervene in those communities based on data that is being assessed and understood in a way that humans could not do.
Great. Hey, thank you very much, guys. My apologies for having to cut us off here, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. And a lot of the pieces that I really wanted to hit today, I think we can hit in the next one of our webinars, which was our last one of this series, where we're going to wrap this up and talk about overall governance. So if you're listening in, you guys know we're going to have a recording posted for you so you can listen to this entire thing, as well as all the other webinars we've done. Our next session focus, and I said social, you know what? I had a couple of copy and paste errors on here, but our next session focus will be on overall governance and how you put a governance system together to focus on these things we've talked about. Of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to let us know. So the next one we're talking about is the G-Force, a G, capital G, being governance on this. I'm going to put out under the chat right now the link for you to go sign up if you'd like. Of course, you can always keep an eye on our social media, and we'll be sending out links later this week on how you join that webinar. So a little information on that webinar. We're trying to really focus on how you balance performance and conformance using risk and looking at how governance can be critical. We're going to wrap this up with some very solid advice on the things that you can do to put your governance system in place to help you with ESG. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining the webinar. Thank you to the panelists. I appreciate all the time and effort that you put into this. Everyone, we'll see you guys next Tuesday. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.